How's it going? My name's Chris. Thanks for having me again at Plug. This talk is about software that's both free, as in freedom, and also commercial, as in people pay for something. How are people earning a living with free software? My aim today is to answer that question with a few examples. I think it's a good thing when people can earn money doing a thing they love that brings value to other people. I'd like it if more free software nerds like ourselves were able to earn a living making free software for the public good so that they can spend more time doing that. What I'm not talking about is this. Other people are happy to run proprietary and free software together on their machines. That's not something I'm particularly interested in, and it's not what I'm talking about today. Commercial software does not mean proprietary software. Making money doesn't mean closed source. Many people believe that you should not charge money for GNU software. This is a misunderstanding. So this is a quote from the GNU Foundation on selling software. I've trimmed the original quote, but this is basically what it says. It says, "We don't think it is unethical to sell free software." That's coming from the people who played a big part in starting the free software movement. What I am talking about is this. So generating income from software that's actually free and open source in the fullest sense. People paying for goods and services, and the open sourceness being completely orthogonal to that, or maybe even a feature that people like. The reason I'm interested in this is it's something I've struggled with for a long time. As a freelance developer, I was content to tinker on open source stuff in my spare time and build proprietary software for clients during the day. Wouldn't it be better to build free software all the time and earn a living from that? So let's talk about some advantages of making money from free software. So not starving is a fairly important one. And even more important is being able to buy more computers. What got me really fired up about this was the Indie Hackers Forum. There's a community of people who are building software products and bootstrapping businesses based off them. After reading the site for a while, I started experimenting with different product ideas. I tinkered with a bunch of different models, including proprietary software. I felt uncomfortable writing proprietary code, but I justified it by telling myself that that's exactly what I do for my clients already, in many cases. After a while, I started seeing a pattern of people building businesses on top of open source software. I saw that often the open source license wasn't a problem at all. Sometimes it even helped. There were much bigger problems like marketing and distribution. I realized it's possible to reconcile a free software ethic with the idea of building a bootstrapped commercial business. So before we get to the 3 case studies, I'm going to go rapid fire through a list of well-known ways to derive an income from open source software. I'm sure some people here and listening have done some of these things already. I'm not going to spend too long on these because they're vague and they often involve large companies with lots of people. I find the case studies more interesting than this list because they're real individuals. They're people who've managed to build profitable business like ventures by themselves, and they're real practical examples, not theoretical ideas. So, like many other free software nerds, consulting is the way I've personally always operated. I have knowledge about free software and how to use it, and people pay me to help them out with that knowledge. For some people, this means sysops and DevOps, and for developers like myself, it means knowing which free software libraries, applications, and frameworks to use to solve a problem and how to use them. Related to consulting, but slightly different, is support. It means providing free software and providing support on free software to companies who use that software. You might have written the software in question, or you might just be an expert in it. Either way, you can get paid to do this, and big companies like Red Hat and Canonical do some of this. You can make money on hosting by hosting free software infrastructure and hosting free software code for people. So this might mean web hosting or mail hosting, where you are managing the servers for your clients. And as someone was saying to me before this, it might mean fully blown software as a service like WordPress. So the software is open source, but you help people out by running an instance of it and managing that for them. Dual licensing is where you've released some free software and you're the copyright owner. Being the copyright owner means you can relicense a fork of the software. So under a dual licensing scheme, you choose to give a proprietary license to companies who are willing to pay you. That might mean they can go ahead and maintain their own proprietary fork without releasing their changes, for example. other arrangements are possible. So a famous example of that was, I think, Qt with, was it Trolltech in the early days? They did this. So feature gating, I made up that term, but I'm sure it has a better name, but I couldn't find it in time for the talk. But feature gating is basically, sorry? Free core. Yeah, open core. Okay, yeah. Yeah, so only give people certain features if they pay for them. So the core product is open source, but you have some proprietary components or plugins that you withhold, and only people who pay get those. Delayed release means you build proprietary software first and make a bunch of money selling it, and then you open source once you've made enough money to cover the cost of development. So this works well for things like video games because most of their sales are made at the start and they sharply drop off. It can work for software with a high novelty factor like games. id Software famously did this with Wolfenstein and their later games. So they released them closed source and then later open sourced them. Certification is where you're the expert in a particular piece of software, so you probably wrote it, and people pay you to test their knowledge of the software, and if they pass the test, they pay you for a certificate. So that allows them to be an independent expert in your software and make money from it. Bounties. A bounty is where somebody pays you to fix bugs or add features to the free software. So this seems to be taking off a bit at the moment. I'm not personally sure of anyone who makes a ton of money doing that or enough to earn a living, but maybe those people are out there. One I didn't add to this list and only thought of later is donations, which again donations seem to be quite a tricky way to make enough money to live off. So which models are used for your project? That list is common theoretical ways to make money from free software, but what we actually care about is like what actually works. So some of these methods only work if you wrote the software, some only work if you're the copyright holder, some work better if you just happen to know how to use the software really well. They also have varying degrees of success. Unfortunately, I don't think there's a lot of data out there about which of these models work for people under which circumstances, so what the trade-offs are, and I don't know which of these models works best for sole operators. Which is what I'm really interested in. So single individuals building software and earning a living off it. So all that would be useful to know, and hopefully, there'll be future studies and data about that. So what I do have are these 3 case studies for people who are actually making free software and earning a living from it. What's interesting is these don't really fit cleanly into any of the models I just listed. Rather, there are elements of those models used at different times and in different ways. So sometimes it's a combination or using more than one of them at a time. So, and I found all these cases through the Indie Hackers forum I was talking about before. So that's predominantly about building proprietary software, but there are lots of people on there who are doing open source stuff as well. So this is Zeno Rocha. I think that's how you pronounce his last name. So in October 2013, Zeno was confined to a hospital bed in a foreign country, not his native country, and he started making a ZSH theme to distract himself. So ZSH, obviously he was on a MacBook. He ported his theme to Terminal app and text editor. And by the end of the first day, he had 5 different versions, which he then tweeted about. And that sort of took off from there. So for the next few years, he continued working on the open source theme, taking PRs and contributions, and the theme continued to gather GitHub stars and attention. And today, Dracula theme is one of the most popular themes ever created. As you can see, it has, you probably can't see, but it has 16,000 stars on GitHub. So he had an already popular project that was open source. So fast forward 7 years to December 2019, and this graph is just after he launched, and you probably can't read it, but he made 73 sales and $3,000 in the first, sort of just after he launched. But so yeah, in December 2019, so 7 years later, after working on Dracula for a while, he decided to learn about sales. He read one business book, I think, and about how to launch, and decided to try and launch like a pro version of Dracula. And his website was already receiving traffic through the GitHub. So 16,000 stars means there were a lot of people finding the GitHub, and some of them went to his website. So he put an email sign-up form on his website saying, if you want to know more about Dracula, I'll email you about it. Put your email in here. Once he'd collected emails from people who opted into hearing more about Dracula, he planned a sequence of emails to send to them, culminating in the launch of Dracula Pro. So he pre-planned this kind of like email marketing type of thing. He then created Dracula Pro and followed through on the email plan, dripping the emails out, and launched it, and immediately had sales, as you can see from this graph. He also has a reasonably popular Twitter account. I think at the time of launch, it was in the thousands of followers. It's now like maybe tens of thousands. But he said that didn't actually result in many sales. He could kind of track where sales of Dracula Pro came through, and not many came from Twitter. So Dracula Pro is basically an enhanced version of the open source offering with more themes, design files, and support. So kind of like the open core idea. Today, it's clear that this has been a financial success. You probably can't read that number, but it's 150 grand. And that's a year and a half after launching it. So one way of looking at that is he made 150 grand in 1.5 years, but he also worked on the theme for 7 years before that and built it into a popular open source project. So it's a common pattern amongst people who bootstrap projects successfully that you read about on indie hackers, where an overnight success is often 10 years in the making, both working on the project, like tinkering on the code, but also getting the word out about it. So what can we learn from the story of Zeno Rocha and his open source Dracula theme? So the first thing he did was build in public. Remember, the first thing he did after he finished those 5 themes on the very first day was tweeted about it. If you don't tell people about what you're building, they have no way to find out about it. And you have no way to get feedback about whether what you're building is going to be useful or not. So yeah, just building something privately basically has not much chance of getting found out. So that's the function of building publicly. It doesn't have to be on Twitter. It could be on a forum related to the field you're developing software for, or an email list you already have related to something you're building. Or whatever the case, if you never tell anyone, no one will ever find out. So the second thing he did was keep building. There were 7 years between conception of the first version and the pro version. And where he was working on the project, he was merging contributions and porting the theme to new apps. And he was updating and telling people about it. Today it's on 186 different apps. I don't think the GitHub stars would have kept growing if he hadn't kept porting it to new apps and tweeting about it and things like that. So the other thing he did was collect emails. I asked him about this on the Indie Hackers forum, and he told me he simply had an email subscription form on the theme pages. People who wanted to be notified about Dracula updates opted in. So that means he had a few thousand emails coming to contact about the launch. And that just about, if you have a few thousand emails from people who are interested in something, and then you launch something they can buy, that almost guarantees the sales. So in marketing, they have this idea of funnels that I have learned about. And you could think about people doing a search for text editor dark mode theme. And then some percentage of those people will find the Dracula GitHub, because it was a prominent dark mode theme, one of the earliest. Some percentage of those people will then click through to the website, and then some percentage of those people will sign up. So you can get kind of a ballpark idea of how many people would be coming in the top of that marketing funnel by those 16,000 stars. You're probably talking about hundreds of thousands of people finding the GitHub page. And he said he launched with a few thousand people on his list. And they were all people who were very keen to know more about Dracula. And finally, he did a launch. So he carefully planned the launch of his Dracula Pro product. He didn't just send out one blast and then forget about it. He sent out multiple emails over several weeks, sort of like engaging with the people who'd signed up and telling them what he was doing and why. And that culminated in the final email announcing the launch. So remember, he was only emailing people who explicitly opted into hearing about Dracula. So it wasn't at all spammy. It was, people who wanted to know. Often people will launch something to a big spike of traffic, which drops off quickly. So a launch is good for kickstarting traffic. And this, in my experience, this is something that happens. You can get a big boost, but you really need to have a way for people to find it after that. And these are called channels. So you need to have a channel via which someone out there in the world can come towards your product. For example, a search engine is a channel that can bring people to your thing. Word of mouth is another. There are a bunch of different channels that you can use to help people find your thing. So the final thing he did was he made something that people actually want. So clearly there was demand for a good dark mode theme, and he was there at the right time. I'm sure many of us have GitHub projects with a handful of stars, but you really need something in high demand before you can do what Zeno did in this example. Building in public or telling people about what you're making is essential for this reason. You need to get feedback on the things you make so you can figure out what people actually want and which things they want. Obviously, Zeno would have had a number of different projects, and this is just the one that took off. And he knew to work more on it because of the feedback he was getting from people. So let's look at case study number 2. Nemiah, I think that's how you pronounce her handle. So Nemiah is a developer from Germany. Is that right? Neve. Oh, right. Okay. The Irish. No, I think Neve is spelled like Niam. Yeah. Anyway, I'll say Nemiah. Nemiah is a developer from Germany. Her project is the second case study I want to talk about. She's earning a living selling paid extensions for her open source software. So it's a web-based invoicing software called Open3A. She's been working on it since 2007. So she started her journey by scratching her own itch. She was in university in 2007 and needed to send invoices to customers for some work she did. So she used PHP to build a basic invoicing system, as many of us probably would, rather than, yeah. She then put it on the internet under a GPL license because she thought someone else might find it useful, which is something many of us have done. So the next thing she did was respond to the market, the people who found it. She soon found people were downloading the PHP code and asking her for new features. One user asked if they could pay her to add features, and she accepted. And more people started asking for features, and she responded to that by improving the application. Sounds obvious, but I guess it isn't always obvious. I know I've resisted it before when people say, oh, can you add this feature? Some of the people paid her for the service of improving it, like that first person. So eventually she wanted to sell Open3A as a product and not just sell her time to people asking for features. She wanted to stay open source, and she didn't want to fiddle around with licensing keys or subscriptions or put in other restrictions that annoyed her in software. So she set up a demo version of the product and started offering extensions for a flat fee. So the product was free, and each time you wanted to download an extension, you paid once for that extension. The model took off with the people who were already interested in the app, and they were purchasing extensions to enhance the basic open source version. In 2013, she added a cloud service, or software as a service product, as we commonly call it. Some people didn't want to deploy their own PHP and MySQL stack, and so they pay her a monthly fee to run an instance for them, take backups, and do updates and stuff like that. So you can see there already she's combined like the open core with hosting. And then this year, she released a physical product. So some customers told her they wanted an on-premise version of the software, not a cloud offering. So she created a version that runs on a Raspberry Pi, and she ships the physical box to the customer. All they have to do is plug it in and turn it on. She remotely manages and monitors those boxes, and that's an additional source of revenue. The interesting thing to me about the physical product is it's can be totally open source still. So what didn't work? She mentions a number of false starts, including selling Open3A on physical CDs, creating a Windows install that never shipped, building multiple sub-applications and related side projects that didn't take off. And that's something many of us have probably wrestled with, that I've wrestled with, is, you don't always want to work on that one thing. There's a shiny new project over here and you get diverted. So anyway, the takeaway from this, I guess, is if you find demand in a particular niche for a particular open source thing you're doing, then you should double down on it and give the customer what they've told you they already want, and keep improving the core thing, and don't run off and chase butterflies. So what can we learn from Nemiah's story? So the first thing to note is she published the very first version of the software. This ties into the build in public idea from the previous case. She doesn't say whether she actually told anyone about it, but clearly traffic eventuated, so presumably she must have spread the word somehow. If she hadn't published the software as free and open source download from day one, then this might not ever have been a business. That's a case where the open source reflex to just put something up on GitHub works in your favor. She put some of her success down to targeting the German market. As a German speaker herself, it was only natural she published the software in German. My guess is in 2007 you could rank for invoicing software in search engines in the German language quite easily. There probably wasn't much going around that time. So she probably had a lot of organic traffic from that. It's common in bootstrapping circles to hear this same story of starting in a small niche. You can always expand later, and starting in a niche often makes marketing easier, so just targeting the 190 million German speakers in the world. Building something small and targeted is generally faster to do as well. You can leave off a whole bunch of features. Another thing she did was respond directly to customer feedback. In the early days, she fixed things and added features for free. Then some people started paying her to make changes. This is a strong signal that what you're making is worth money to people if they want to pay you to make updates to it. It also ties into what we saw in the first case study with regards to making something people want. If people actually tell you what they want and will pay for, then make that. Sometimes the hardest thing is to figure out what the actual problem is that you can solve and that people will pay for. So again, I think that's interesting because the being open source really played into it being public and helped people find it. So the third, whoops, I forgot to advance the slide. The third case study is Caleb Porzio. I should just say as well, yeah, what I find interesting about, go back to Nemiah's, what I find interesting about Nemiah's story is she didn't have a big popular GitHub repository or 10,000 followers on Twitter. She literally just had the software up on a web page. She simply built the thing people wanted, put it out there, kept working on what people wanted, and figured out a way to earn income from the thing she'd made. So I like that story because most of us don't have 10,000 followers on GitHub or Twitter or a project with 16,000 stars. So for the third, excuse me, and final case study, I want to tell you about Caleb Porzio. Caleb is a prolific open source developer working in public. He's built popular libraries on PHP and Laravel, and he has a lot of followers on Twitter again. So here's a chart of Caleb's income, which he's making purely from GitHub sponsors, from GitHub sponsorships. So 1,306 people are sponsoring his projects on GitHub today. If you look at the shape of this graph, it starts out quite flat, but it has two distinct changes where the slope of the graph becomes more vertical. You can see that he's now earning a reasonable wage for an engineer purely from people sponsoring his work on GitHub, which I must say is quite a feat. Said before, donations don't seem to work that well, but GitHub sponsorships, in his particular case, seem to be working quite well. So how did he make that happen? So before we get to the reason for the changes in the graph, let's take a quick look at some of the stats. Here we can see he's got a couple of projects that a huge number of people are using. So he's made these two very popular projects, Livewire and Alpine.js, and he has many followers on Twitter and GitHub. So that's the base he's starting from, building projects that people already want to begin with lots of people interested in his work. So let's take a look at the graph again. You can see there, you probably can't make out that number, but it's $6,876 at the first little bump there. So there are people on GitHub with repositories with just as many stars as Caleb, and their sponsorship open, but they're not making as much money from sponsorship. There's even a famous blog post called "GitHub Stars Won't Pay the Rent," which I recommend you read. It's a good read. In this case, that's clearly wrong. So what triggered the first bump? What he did to get that first slope change is hold the release of a new project he was working on to ransom. People who sponsored him on GitHub get instant access to the source code, and only once he hits a threshold of sponsors does he unlock the source for everybody. In the end, he hit that threshold quite quickly. I think it was 75 sponsors, and released the code. So this is a bit like what id Software did with their games, but on a shorter time scale. So he's sort of saying, I'm building this thing. If you want it now, you have to sponsor me on GitHub, but it's going to be open source anyway at some point. So this is a pretty interesting model. It clearly relies on having a big following on Twitter, made up of other developers who want the thing you're making. He discovered demand for the project by posting about it on Twitter and seeing the reaction from people. And then obviously he's done that before and without any reaction. And this particular time, people said, yes, I want that. So that's the thing he built. I'm interested to know if this same kind of thing would work on smaller projects for smaller amounts and maybe not announcing on Twitter, but announcing on, a forum for a particular niche. So what about the second change in the slope of the graph? You can see that it goes quite vertical there starting at $29,000. So how did he get people to start sponsoring him at an even higher rate than before? Get this working, he turned to an age-old way of deriving an income. He was educating people. So he created a series of free videos showing how to use his popular Livewire project. Then he created more advanced videos and he made these available to users only when they sponsored him on GitHub. So to me, this latter model is interesting because it seems like something that could apply to smaller projects with fewer stars and still generate some income. One of the most reliable ways to make money is by creating educational content. You see that all the time on the indie hackers forums. People even do this with popular free software that they didn't create before, like Blender and GIMP. There's tons of courses for that kind of thing out there. So I think educating people is fertile ground to explore for solo founders building open source software. And those are the stories from people making money from free and open source software. Doing this lets them spend more of their time working on interesting and meaningful free software instead of working for the man or whatever. When some people are able to earn a living from free software, we all benefit because free software is in the public good. So hopefully this has been useful. Thanks very much for having me again. Is that too quick? Yeah, I can take questions. Do I know how to? Should I unscreencast it or? Oh, that's cool. I'll just leave it. Yep. Yeah, at a very small scale. So, you know, one of my projects is making money, which is music applications, so for Android. And so I have one app which is closed source and one app is open source, and they both make, relatively speaking, the same amount of sales. So basically, I don't think that having an app be open source is a blocker to it being sellable. Like that may have once been the case, but the number of users who are going to go on Google Play, look at your app, go to the GitHub, download the source, figure out how to compile it, and then run it on their machine. If they're going to go through that trouble, they're welcome to it. But most people won't do that. Most people coming to find those music apps on the store, they're not developers. They're not really interested in doing that. They just want to pay the $5 or $3 or whatever. And yeah, so that's my small experience. I also tried a Gittier hosting company, which had got 2 customers, but I'm shutting it down now because the growth was too slow. But yeah, that was the model where basically you host free software for people. And if people are going to do that, I'd say probably the biggest thing I've learned from research in this space is the hard thing isn't building the product. People like us, because we know how to write code and how to deploy things and all that stuff. The really hard bit is actually distribution and marketing. So how do you get the people who would want to buy the thing, see the thing? Ideally, if marketing was perfect, only the people who actually want to know about the thing would find out about it, and no one else. And and you could reach 100% of those people. But so that's the big challenge with most of this stuff is like, how do you set up channels where those people can find it? I think both can work. Sorry? Oh, yeah. So the question was, with the GitHub sponsorship idea, do I see it as working better for people who work on one thing for a long time, or people who work on multiple things that might help out multiple sets of people? Is that right? Yeah. And actually, just the other day, I found someone in the latter camp, and sponsored him myself because his work was really useful to me. And so I think both can work. Um, that guy who's building lots of different things is extremely prolific and constantly publishing packages for the Clojure language. And I don't know if he's earning a living, but he has a lot of sponsors. Whereas the case that I talked about earlier was someone who just has one or two projects, and he's specifically getting sponsors for the main one, And so that Livewire product and the Alpine JS that Caleb was doing, they both have a lot of GitHub stars. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. So I don't. I've used Mailchimp on projects where I'm working with other people and they wanted to use that, but I actually have a tiny, terrible PHP script that does a similar kind of thing, and probably doesn't work very well and results in people bouncing. And but but yeah, I mean, basically, I don't think I don't personally feel there's anything unethical at all about someone putting their email, like asking someone if they want to know more and checking their email. But yeah, you're right. Some of those services are a little bit, I don't know, yeah, questionable. I've never paid for it. You mean, is it worth it in terms of the ease of use, I guess? Like, oh, I see what you mean. So if someone doesn't want to opt in to finding out that information. Yeah, so you were saying, uh, like having an alternate place where the person who might otherwise want to sign up, they don't want to sign up and give you their email. They want to find out what's going on a blog or something like that. Yeah, yeah. So they don't want to open the email or have the trackers. Yeah, I mean that sounds like a good way to go. Having an additional place where it's published online, so people there's there's always going to be like with that funnels idea. There's always going to be more people who are not on the mailing list see the things, than there are people on the mailing list. The same with I think with social media and stuff like that. I think it's often the case that for every for every like on a tweet, there might be 10 people or 100 people who also saw that tweet. You know, there's a large mass of people out there who are kind of like silent on the internet. Yeah. Yeah. So the question is tracking people between different ways that they've read your content, and did they come through this particular funnel and find you this way? Or yeah, no, I mean, I personally don't do any of that. I'm just not really that interested in it, and it does feel a little bit weird and creepy. But I know that they really do push that on these sites. They say, oh, you have to do all, marketing people say you have to do that stuff. So you can figure out where people are coming from and stuff like that. Um, I don't know. I guess it's a personal choice, like what people want to do. I think it's quite hard to do. Like there are lots of ways that people can reach things, thankfully, privately without you being able to know where they came from. I personally, whenever someone sends me a link with those UTM trackers, just delete them from the URL, then visit the URL without the tracker. Yeah, it's become a lot of crossover nowadays. You know, free software isn't the small band of hackers that it once was. Yeah. More, more questions? Oh, yep. Yeah, so that's affiliate links, I think that's called. So like they'll have what you're talking about is a YouTube channel, and then at the end they'll have a link to some product, and they get a cut whenever that product sells. Yeah, I haven't done any of that myself, but I feel like this conversation, I probably know as much as you guys about this. So it should be a conversation where we're all talking to each other rather than me. Yeah. So maybe I'll finish up there. Yeah. Thanks very much for having me.